Hello, fourth grade. I'm back for chapter 3, Farmer Boy. We're going to be reading Winter Night. In the beginning of this chapter, you can see these are the shoes that Almanzo wore. Remember, they're moccasins, right? He didn't get to have boots because his feet were still growing, so he had to have moccasins that could stretch out more easily as his feet were growing. And in the last chapter, we we saw the chores that Almanzo, Royal, and Father did in the evening before they ate dinner, and how they kind of followed a pattern of what they had to do in the evening. They had to wait. The girls were setting the table. The boys and the men were waiting, and then once Mother said everything was ready, then they could go and sit down. And then you saw the progression of how they were served their meals and all the food that they were eating. And I'm interested to see how you compared their meals with yours, and what was so different about meals, because I'm sure there are a lot of differences between what they do in their evening and what you do for your supper time. So now we're going to read Winter Night. So this will be everything that happens after they're done eating their meal. Okay, after they're done eating their supper meal. After supper, Almanzo took care of his moccasins. Every night he sat by the kitchen stove and rubbed them with tallow. He held them in the heat and rubbed the melting tallow into the leather with the palm of his hands. His moccasins would always be comfortably soft and keep his feet dry as long as the leather was well greased. And he didn't stop rubbing until it would absorb no more tallow. So he had to do that every evening, because if he didn't put the tallow on them, then they would not be waterproof. They would not be, and they would not be protect his feet as well. So that's something he had to do every single evening with his moccasins. Royal sat by the stove too. He greased his boots. Almanzo couldn't have boots. He had to wear moccasins because he was a little boy. Mother and the girls washed the dishes and swept the pantry kitchen, and downstairs in the big cellar, Father cut up carrots and potatoes to feed the cows next day. So they all had chores after dinner too, right? The boys had to rub the tallow onto their moccasins and the boots, and Mother and the girls cleaned up after dinner. They washed the dishes, they swept the pantry, and then Father went downstairs where it was cool where they kept a lot of their food, and he would cut up some of the carrots and potatoes. He would look for the ones that were, he would cut them up so that way they would have pieces to feed them the next day. When the work was done, Father came up the cellar stairs bringing a big pitcher of sweet cider and a pan full of apples. Royal took the corn popper and a pannikin of popcorn. Mother banked the kitchen fire with ashes for the night, and when everyone else had left the kitchen, she blew out the candles. They had to make sure those candles were out, right? They did not want to leave. Number one, they didn't want to waste them, because if no one was in the room, they shouldn't have the lights on, right? They shouldn't have the candles burning. And number two, in case of fire, right? They want to make sure that the candles are out if no one is in the room. They all settled down cozily by the big stove in the dining room wall. The back of the stove was in the parlor, where nobody went except when company came. It was a fine stove. It warmed the dining room and the parlor. Its chimney warmed the bedrooms upstairs, and its whole top was an oven. So the stove, they had this wood stove basically in the center of the house. They had one in the kitchen, their main cooking stove, and then they had one that they could still use to bake things in as well, but it was more as the heat for their home, and it would heat most of the home. They didn't have heating or forced air, right, because they didn't have electricity. So the stovepipe went up through the middle of the home, and the heat that radiated off of the stovepipe would heat the upstairs, so that way it didn't completely freeze. It was still cold up there because they didn't have any blowing heat, but at least they had some heat that would radiate off of that stovepipe that went up the center of the house. Royal opened its iron door, and with the poker he broke the charred logs into a simmering bed of coals. He put 3 handfuls of popcorn into the big wire popper and shook the popper over the coals. In a little while a kernel popped, then another, then 3 or 4 at once, and all at once furiously the hundreds of little pointed kernels exploded. When the big dish pan was heaping full of fluffy white popcorn, Alice poured melted butter over it and stirred and salted it. It was hot and crackling crisp and deliciously buttery and salty, and everyone could eat all he wanted. Mother knitted and rocked in her high-backed rocking chair. Father carefully scraped a new axe handle with a bit of broken glass. Royal carved a chain of tiny links from a smooth stick of pine, and Alice sat on her hassock doing her woolwork embroidery. And they all ate popcorn and apples and drank sweet cider. Except Eliza Jane. Eliza Jane read aloud the news in the New York Weekly paper. So you can see in the picture, right, they're all sitting around. You could see Royal with the popcorn popper and Mother and Father, doing their thing. The girls sitting around on the floor and Almanzo in the back drinking his cider. You can see them just cozily sitting together in the evening. Almanzo sat on a footstool by the stove, an apple in his hand, a bowl of popcorn by his side, and his mug of cider on the hearth by his feet. He bit the juicy apple, then he ate some popcorn, then he took a drink of cider. He thought about popcorn. Popcorn is American. Nobody but the Indians ever had popcorn till after the Pilgrim Fathers came to America. On the first Thanksgiving Day, the Indians were invited to dinner, and they came and poured out on the table a big bag full of popcorn. The Pilgrim Fathers didn't know what it was. The Pilgrims' mothers didn't know what it was either. The Indians had popped it, but probably it wasn't very good. Probably they didn't butter it or salt it, and it would be cold and tough after they had carried it around in bags of skins. Almanzo looked at every kernel before he ate it. They were all different shapes. He had eaten thousands of handfuls of popcorn and never found two kernels alike. Then he thought that if he had some milk, he would have popcorn and milk. You can fill a glass full to the brim with milk. Fill another glass the same size, brim full of popcorn, and then you can put all the popcorn kernel by kernel into the milk, and the milk will not run over. You cannot do this with bread. Popcorn and milk are the only two things that will go into the same place. And I challenge you to try that experiment. Try filling a cup full of milk and filling a cup to the very top with popcorn, or actually 2 cups to the very top with milk, and then put bread into one and put popcorn into the other and see what happens. You'll notice that the milk will not overflow with the popcorn, but it will with the bread, because the bread is heavier, right, than the milk, and the popcorn is lighter than the milk, so that's why it won't make it overflow. But try it. See if it works for yourself. Then, too, they are good to eat, but Almanzo was not very hungry, and he knew Mother would not want the milk pans disturbed. If you disturb milk when the cream is rising, the cream will not be so thick. So Almanzo ate another apple and drank cider with his popcorn and did not say anything about popcorn and milk. When the clock struck 9, that was bedtime. Royal laid away his chain and Alice her woolwork. Mother stuck her needles in her ball of yarn, and Father wound the tall clock. He put another log in the stove, and closed the dampers. "It's a cold night," Mr. Corse said. 40 below zero, said Father, "and it will be colder before morning." Brr, 40 below. Royal lighted a candle, and Almanzo followed him sleepily to the stairway door. The cold on the stairs made him wide awake at once. He ran clattering upstairs. The bedroom was so cold that he could hardly unbutton his clothes and put on his long woolen nightshirt and nightcap. He should have knelt down to say his prayers, but he didn't. His nose ached with cold and his teeth were chattering. He dived into the soft goose feather bed between the blankets and pulled the covers over his nose. The next thing he knew, the tall clock downstairs was striking 12. The darkness pressed his eyes and forehead, and it seemed full of little prickles of ice. He heard someone move downstairs, then the kitchen door opened and shut. He knew Father was going to the barn. Even those great barns could not hold all Father's wealth of cows and oxen and horses and hogs and calves and sheep. 25 young cattle had to sleep under a shed in the barnyard. So they're outside, even though they are covered by a roof from the shed, it still was not inside, so they weren't as protected. If they lay still all night, on nights as cold as this, they would freeze in their sleep. So at midnight in the bitter cold, Father got out of his warm bed and went to wake them up. Out in the dark, cold night, Father was rousing up the young cattle. He was cracking his whip and running behind them around and around the barnyard. He would run and keep them galloping till they were warmed with exercise. Almanzo opened his eyes again, and the candle was sputtering on the bureau. Royal was dressing. His breath froze white in the air. The candlelight was dim, as though the darkness were trying to put it out. Suddenly Royal was gone. The candle was not there, and Mother was calling from the foot of the stairs, "Almanzo! What's the matter? Be you sick? It's 5 o'clock." So they got up before, Royal had gotten up before 5 o'clock, and Almanzo was so tired that he didn't even completely get up when Almanzo did, and then when Mother yelled, oh, you be sure he was going to get up. He crawled out shivering. He pulled on his trousers and waist and ran downstairs to button up by the kitchen stove. Father and Royal had gone to the barns. Almanzo took the milk pails and hurried out. The night seemed very large and still, and the stars sparkled like frost in the black sky. So it's still dark at 5 o'clock in the winter time, in the morning. When the chores were done and he came back with Father and Royal to the warm kitchen, breakfast was almost ready. So the same chores they did in the evening, they did in the morning as well. So they did those twice during the day, once in the morning, once in the evening. When the chores were done, he came back with Father and Royal to the warm kitchen. Breakfast was almost ready. How good it smelled. Mother was frying pancakes, and the big blue platter kept keeping hot on the stove's hearth was full of plump brown sausage cakes and their brown gravy. Almanzo washed as quickly as he could and combed his hair. As soon as Mother finished straining the milk, they all sat down and Father asked the blessing for breakfast. There was oatmeal with plenty of thick cream and maple sugar. There were fried potatoes and the golden buckwheat cakes, as many as Almanzo wanted to eat, with sausages and gravy or with butter and maple syrup. There were preserves and jams and jellies and donuts, but best of all, Almanzo liked the spicy apple pie with its thick, rich juice and its crumbly crust. He ate 2 big wedges of pie. Then, with his cap's warm earmuffs over his ears and his muffler wrapped up to his nose and the dinner pail in his mittened hands, he started down the long road to another day at school. He did not want to go. He did not want to go. He did not want to be there when the big boys thrashed Mr. Corse, but he had to go to school because he was almost 9 years old. Alrighty. So what an interesting way that they do their evening, right? Their nighttime, and then how their mornings go. So we're getting to see like a full school day or a full day in the life of the Wilder family. So I hope you again are really liking this book as much as I am, and make sure you answer those questions completely and thoroughly and thoughtfully. And I will see you soon. Bye.